Steven Universe and all associated images are property of Cartoon Network, Rebecca Sugar, and any and all other respective owners. I don't know them all. All footage in this video has been used for the purpose of critique parody under fair use. Please support the official release. Today I sit down and make a video with the intent of answering a question that I and a lot of other fans seem to have about the show. And that question being whether or not all gems are capable of creating bubbles around other gems. I really genuinely thought I was going to have a lot to say on this topic, but when I sat down to actually write out the script for this video, I came to the realization that there are only 2 points that I need to make here. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to attempt to prove that homeworld gems, despite being more advanced than the crystal gems, are not capable of bubbling other gems, and then I'm going to try to explain why it is that the crystal gems can, or at least come up with a plausible reason why the crystal gems can. First and foremost, though, I think we need to really quick define what bubbling actually is, because Steven's bubble and the bubbles that gems create around other gems are not exactly the same thing. They're very, very similar, I think, but they're not exactly the same thing. I'm going to refer to the bubbles that the crystal gems put around other gems that they need to store, and Steven's bubble as bubbles and Steven's bubble. That said, bubbles have been shown to put the gems that they contain in perfect stasis. Those gems are unable to form bodies or in any way interact with the world around them because their minds are put into stasis. We know this is a fact because when Peridot was bubbled and then released, she continued speaking the exact sentence that she began right before she was poofed, as if she was completely unaware that any time had passed other than the time that it took her to regenerate. But it would appear that if a gem already has a body, that if a bubble is put around a gem that is not poofed, they are not put into stasis, since Steven was entirely aware of everything around him while he was in Garnet's bubble in Monster Buddies, was able to move around and was able to break himself out of the bubble under his own power. However, it only seems that way. Remember, Steven is entirely different from any other gem. Bubbles may not affect him the way that they affect everyone else. We also know that a bubbled gem can be sent right back to the temple from anywhere on the planet, which is a little odd considering that typically the crystal gems need warp pads to move themselves and others, as well as other objects, around the world. This would make the ability to bubble things slightly inconsistent with the rest of what we've seen of gem technology in the series. But then there are times when it seems like occasionally bubbles can't be automatically transported back to the temple, since we see Garnet arriving through the warp with a bubble. It seems like the crystal gems bubble other gems specifically so that those gems don't get free again and wreak havoc and force the crystal gems to eventually kill them. It seems to be a kind of mercy, a preventative measure that not only preserves the lives of humans, but preserves the lives of the corrupted gems themselves. If you could just transport a bubble back to the temple with a thought, why not do it? It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and assume that we occasionally see bubbles being brought home through the warps for aesthetic purposes to give the audience a clue as to what that particular gem has been doing in the time between episodes, and that all bubbled gems can be teleported back to the temple as automatically as we've seen in the past. All of that said, bubbling seems to be something that has developed independently from other gem technology, and we can tell that pretty much for sure by looking at Homeworld, by looking at the technology that they use to contain gems. We have seen gem holding cells now as of the episode Jailbreak, and we know that they are nothing like the bubbles that the crystal gems use to hold their enemies. It seems that on Homeworld, if a gem is to be contained, they are put behind a gem destabilizer force field, which will destabilize their body and automatically repoof them should they try to leave. It also seems to be quite painful since Ruby reacts very, very strongly to a single touch from the force field. And there are a couple things to be said about this method of containing someone. The first and foremost that comes to mind being that your captive is conscious and aware and capable of being interrogated, but it was pretty clear that Jasper and Peridot had absolutely no intention of interrogating their prisoners. In fact, they left them alone most of the time. The only prisoner we see them interacting with at all was Sapphire, and that's just because her singing was annoying Jasper, and Jasper wanted to tell her to stop. Let's look at the way the fight between the crystal gems and Jasper went in the episode The Return. Before Steven is knocked out and our viewpoint character is therefore disconnected from the action, we see that Garnet's component halves specifically, are poofed. We also see that Pearl and Amethyst intend to continue fighting, which means they were very likely poofed as well. I just can't imagine them going quietly and allowing themselves to be drug onto the ship. And from what we've seen, it's not possible to knock a gem unconscious, only to poof them. So here's my question. If all of your enemies but one are already poofed, and you don't intend on interrogating them, why not bubble them so that there's absolutely no chance of them escaping. We've already established that a bubble puts the bubbled gem into stasis, which means they're literally incapable of doing anything. It seems kind of silly to take that risk if you have the ability to bubble your enemy and prevent that risk. Now, I can understand tossing Steven into a cell. They didn't know that the force field wouldn't work on him, and he didn't poof. But the others, it would just make sense. And the only reason I can think of to explain why they didn't is because they weren't able to. Which brings us around to Steven's bubble, his defensive bubble, which is obviously a lot sturdier than a regular bubble, and may or may not put a poofed gem that is held within it into stasis. We don't know yet. But it also doesn't seem to have the ability to teleport, either. If it did, Steven could just put a bubble around himself and then teleport himself back to the temple whenever he wanted to. Which, now that I think about it, would be a really cool ability for him to have. But that's entirely beside the point. My point is, notice that when Steven first summoned Rose's shield, now his shield, the other gems were surprised. And I've already indirectly discussed why that is in my gem weapons video, and I think it's because gem weapons are unique enough to the individual that until the other gems saw Steven summon the shield, they honestly didn't know if there was enough Rose left in him for him to be able to summon that weapon or if he would get a different one. But none of them seemed surprised to see him create a defensive bubble. That implies that the defensive bubble was one of Rose's abilities that she used often, that was not one of the abilities that she had to discover for herself like her gem weapon, that it was something that she was always able to do in the way that most gems can use all of their natural gem abilities without even thinking about it. We've also seen bismuth, or the thing that we've been calling bismuth in the fandom, stored within the pocket dimension in Lion's Mane in a rose quartz bubble, and I have theorized that the reason that bismuth is there instead of in the temple is because it was one of the first gems to ever be bubbled before the temple was built and there was a place to store them properly. I've also theorized that Rose was a brilliant scientist who was able to create organic gem hybrids and who once worked on establishing kindergartens on other planets. If that is true and Rose is really that intelligent, is it really too much of a stretch to say that she adapted one of her abilities, the ability to bubble things, into a way to put enemy gems into stasis so that they wouldn't have to be shattered? It still doesn't explain how bubbles are able to be automatically teleported back to the temple, but it does explain where the ability to bubble gems in the first place came from. It came from Rose. It was a technique that she developed and was eventually able to teach other gems to perform as well. Either that or she was able to pass some of her own powers onto them, in a similar way to how Garnet has been seen passing on her future vision to Steven for short periods of time, just on a more permanent level. Now, is that even possible? I don't really know, but it's the only thing that makes sense. I keep coming back to those scenes in Jailbreak, and it just doesn't make sense that if Jasper were able to bubble gems, that she wouldn't have bubbled the crystal gems. And if only the crystal gems can bubble things, I can't think of another reason why that would be true, unless the power was developed originally by Rose. Call it a stretch if you want, but it makes sense to me. But more importantly, guys, what did you think of this theory? Do you think it tears down barriers, or should I have kept it stored within the bubble of my own imagination? Let's get a discussion going in the comments section down below. Either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later. Do you have a theory idea or merely a musing about the show that you'd like me to discuss? You can head on over to my Facebook page and send me a message detailing your ideas, and if I find them interesting enough, I'll be sure to respond. Or you could head on over to my Tumblr page and send me an ask. If it's not something that I've covered before, I'll be sure to answer. If you are on Facebook or Tumblr, I also recommend that you like and or follow me there as well to keep up to date on all of my content as well as any supplementary content that I might post on either of those sites. And if you know anyone on Facebook or Tumblr who might find my content interesting, please share it with them. I'd really appreciate it.